So, hello everyone, welcome to another Around the Block talk. And today we have with us Alex Albano, and she's a very influential figure in the blockchain community, also recognized as 100 most influential women in tech in Singapore. So she has served as the director of marketing and sales at ChainStack blockchain, and she's currently the founder of Accha Labs. And she has worked on various blockchain projects, from decentralized satellites to setting up a Bitcoin node on the International Space Station, and various other blockchain projects like a decentralized exchange, traded funds, and also MaDAO, which is the world's first non-depreciating currency. So very excited to have you, Alex, and I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you so much, Pratik. It's really a delight to be part of this series. I'm really excited to really be part of this series. And today, let me share my screen. Perhaps we can just go straight into the meaty part. We're going to take a look at the future of data ownership. And let me see. Okay. Can you see my screen?
Yes, it's there.
Great. So I feel really excited about this topic. And if you've seen like a thread throughout my career, it's all been around infrastructure. So infrastructure for blockchain and data in reality, right? So how are we going to look at what is the future of data ownership? And it is quite a difficult topic to unpack. So I will do my best. It will be kind of intense, but I will try and keep it at a good pace. And then I'm very keen to engage in the conversation on social media. When you see in this video, or for the audience that is now live with us for this recording, please make sure you take all of this critically and you come back with more questions and reflections. This is a very much, an open topic. There is no hard and fast rule, and things are really evolving, especially when it comes to looking at data ownership in the context of Web3. So it's very it's charting, new territories altogether. So I like to think with a point of provocation in a way. So this is an old statement. This is 40 years ago or so, right? So a data-driven world will be an era of involuntary transparency. How are we faring against these 40 years down the line? Are we in a data-driven world? That's for sure. That's definitely something that has happened, since. Is it an era of transparency? That's questionable, or that's, to be taken critically, but for sure there is a degree of surveillance that we can see, as a byproduct of transparency, whether that's for commercial or for political purposes, but data-driven transparency, for sure. Whether that's involuntary or voluntary, that's also an interesting topic, and I think that will open up whatever is also at the core of the need of a Web3 audience here, where we can claim back some of the control and consent over the degree of transparency that we're willing to give about our data and with our data. So I'm going to come back to this very sentence after we've gone through the journey of unpacking data ownership. Let's see, if there are more reflection on this. So if you want to look at data ownership, you have to look at the governance and the infrastructure of the data. What does that mean? It means that we have to look at who has control over the data, who has responsibility, who has some fiduciary duties over how the data is accessed and used. And then ownership is tightly linked with the value of the data itself. We will see why the two things are linked and how. So, but also where is this value coming from? Is it intrinsic in the data? I think instinctively we know that it's not that straightforward to see that there is value in data. And then I will try and present three different models for how these claims over the value of the data or the ownership, the two things are very much linked, are enforced. So we're looking at data monopolies, That's something that will feel very, very familiar. Data trust are also very familiar, but it is interesting to reflect on their existence and the fact that, to me, it would be an interesting new chunk of development also for Web3, and then data commons. We're going to look at both centralized and decentralized commons. So, we're packed for a long and interesting journey. But before we start, I think it's always important to clarify how we're using the words, the terminology around this conversation. Traditionally, we looked at data controllers. Data controller is whoever has a degree of control over the storage and the access to the data. I prefer the term data collector. Data collector, it's kind of better reflection over the dynamic how the data is generated. So it can control the data, but eventually has collected the data to begin with, right? Then you have the traditional term is data subject. So who is the data about? But I prefer the term data generator, and I will give my reasoning for it. So that's whoever is the agent that creates the data. So that's what we would say is the end user in a social media platform, for example, right? It's a data generator, right? Us as end users. And then we have data services. Those are the actors that are using the data, and we should be very careful at not conflating it completely with the data controller. So there is, a flourishing market of third parties that are just data services, but they're not data collectors. And likewise, there are, businesses who are just in it for the generation and collection of data, and then selling and having commercial models around the data itself. I hope it's not too fast-paced, but I'm gonna keep going. Then even you, Pratik, you just stop me and ask questions, as you see fit.
Sure.
So first question, I think, we have to start with what it is, that we're talking about. So what are data? And it's very important that we add one word to just the collection of the information, and that's the intention. So to me, there is no collection of data unless that's intentional, right? There is a reasons why and a conscious act that is happening, right? So there are two main school of thoughts here, right? There is the public that is using public infrastructure. The internet is a public infrastructure, but by any means it is definitely, right? And there is an interaction with these means, with this infrastructure, and that creates data. Therefore, one school of thought is that data is generated by the public using public infrastructure. Therefore, the ownership resides with the public, and that data should be available to the public. The counter argument, the other side, is that data itself does not exist just because someone is interacting with something. It is about extracting from raw material. Like we all have a name or an age, a gender. That's just raw material. That's not necessarily data. Data is an intention over the generation of the data. And it can be pinpointed with an event. Normally it's an interaction with a platform or a service online, right? I create an account with Google, then the information about me, such as my name or my address or some of my preferences, become data that Google is collecting, right? So it's a conscious act. Therefore, there is this raw material, which is, facts about things, right? Information that is available about things and people. And then there is a conscious act, deliberate act that creates the data. And we will see how this becomes an important view when it comes to value extraction. But all in all, if you're wearing the lenses of the economic value of data creation is an act of labor, and that creates capital. Data itself is capital can be extracted. So why do we care about data ownership? After saying all of these, right? We have to look at how the data is produced, which actors are involved in its production, because this will influence who will have a claim over the ownership of the data. And if you claim ownership of the data, then you will be able to claim value over the data itself. It's very important that we unpack that. So when I was reflecting on the value of data itself, instinctively, I think we all see that some of the data is interesting, some of the data is not. Some of the data is good, accurate, some other is not. But one thing that most people will think about is that data is a renewable resource, unlimited renewable resource. Like I can copy it. I can make as many copies as I want, right? It's not a finite resource. There is no, intrinsically, there is no scarcity over the data. Data doesn't run out. That said, so if you're looking at data as a renewable resource, then it's very difficult to pair value over it because there is no scarcity. Scarcity is associated with the ownership of something. Like I own something, therefore it is mine. It is like maybe 1, 2, it's like quantifiable, but it is something that I control, and then I can extract value by giving access to it or selling it or renting it, right? So the value of the ownership is tightly paired with scarcity, and data itself has no scarcity intrinsically. So we have to build construct. These are the models that I mentioned earlier to fabricate a degree of scarcity to enforce ownership and extract value. So that's where data monopolies, trust, and data commons are coming into play. Now, the interesting new spin that is coming is that Web3 is coming and saying, hey, I can make data itself scarce. I can enforce scarcity cryptographically. So that's when you have tokens generations and NFT, for example. You can enforce scarcity of data using blockchain. So that comes as a surprise, I think, and it's a big challenger over the traditional models around data ownership. And we're all here for it because disruption is good and is fun, and opens up new business opportunity. So,
Alex, can I ask a question over here? So, like you also gave the example of NFT, and are we in Web3? Are we able to create scarcity of the data itself, or only the scarcity of its ownership? Or
it's a very interesting point. I'm going to unpack a little bit how the data ownership actually changes with Web3. In reality, the data itself remains non-scarce, but we can create value directly from the transaction of an enforced credential over the ownership on the data, right? The NFT itself does not have data inside, right? And then we will see, like, I have, I can get more into details later, on how we can unpack all the data in a blockchain, ecosystem. But when it comes to NFT, big misunderstanding is that NFT is a valuable piece of data. No, NFT is a pointer to a specific valuable, presumably, or subjectively valuable. We can go into the subjectiveness of the value of it, but it's a pointer to that, and the NFT itself locks the ownership, and the ownership then locks the scarcity and the value associated with the NFT.
Right, certainly, sure.
Right, it's a bit multi-step, but I hope we're going to get into the details of it. I think it's super, super interesting.
Sure.
And there is a lot of reflection collectively as an industry that we have to do and unpacking data governance. And I'm also challenging that. I have a bit of provocation over the reality then of the infrastructure as it is. So I think let's start, in all of this, well, to just clarify one thing, we touched on the subjective value of data. One thing that is not obvious sometimes is that the value of the data goes way beyond financial value, where it goes into influencing the public discourse, or influencing personal behavior, or influencing behavior at scale. So it has become an urgent and pressing matter. And Web3 as an infrastructure, alternative infrastructure, is coming quite fast to try and resolve some of these, right? Regulation is trying to curb or to regulate some of the, or propose some limits over some of, the accumulation of data by some parties. But, it's not happening that fast. And there are strong arguments against, interfering with common businesses, right? Now we are seeing why and how. So I hope it's not too theoretical, but I get super fascinated when it gets to the economic side of the data value. So how is value created? Start with the data creation itself. And once again, here we have two parties, like two opposite poles. One that says that the data is created in relations to the process of data creation. So it's a capital that belongs to the infrastructure that has enabled the data creation. So let me unpack that. Data is created through a process that necessitates infrastructure, right? You need a platform. So you need to spend money to create that platform, to run it, to own it, right? To maintain it. Therefore, it's a legitimate claim as a compensation for these costs for the platform to own that data, right? I spend money giving you this nice service, this social platform. Therefore, in return, you're paying me with your data. That's the bottom line. So data becomes capital-centric, right, in the data creation. The opposite side says that data itself actually is not fungible, right? Specific data about me is mine because it is about me. I created it. So I should be compensated. The value should be for me as a generator of data, right? So it shouldn't belong to the platform, it should belong to me. Now we know that as infrastructure goes, this is hardly enforceable at all. But Web3, once again, is coming and challenging that. The second layer of data value comes from what it's called formally as stewardship, data stewardship. It's a bit of an unusual term, but it's not that difficult, I think, intuitively to understand. It's some sort of framework that will enforce the access and the rights over how the data is accessed, right? So it's like an intermediary, an agreed intermediary that will be almost like a concierge service over the data. And that will confer to these, to this entity benefits of ownership. And we will see how that's going to play out. So a data steward is deciding who has access to the data, under which conditions, and to whose benefit is very important. You will see this disintermediation also comes into play with blockchain and Web3. And finally, sometimes people misunderstand that the rights to access and control the data are the same as extracting the value itself, but actually is a separate step, and that's on the decision making. So that's when the terms that are decided at stewardship level are enforced. So that will clarify access types that can be monetized, commercial models, selling the data itself, and so on. So that's the decision making that is built on top of the stewardship rights that have been agreed upon.
So can we also say that with Web3, we want to change the data steward from platform to the creator of that data?
Yes, absolutely. I think that's the biggest challenge. And that's what it's coming. We're seeing now, on all these models, how the data is created, stored, accessed, and the value of mined. We will see that it's what I call a generator-centric model, right? So whoever generates the data as a user should be extracting the value directly, but you have to control it, right? You have to own it, you have to store it yourself, right?
Right, certainly.
And that's what Web3 is going to come in and do. So this is like the most common model. I called it monopoly because it's self-explanatory. We know what we're talking about, right? These are the Facebooks and the Googles out there. So it's free data for free service. If it's free, you're the product. We're all being there, right? This is kind of intuitively true. And it's interesting for me to frame it as a barter. It's an implied barter. I give you access to free services in exchange for your data. It's transactional, and it's implied, it's assumed that the other party knows what they're into. In reality, we know that it is kind of shady, right? The terms on how that data is collected and then used and then sold on, it's far from being transparent and fair, right? But this is like the most problematic and unfortunately the most common model out there. So once again, it's a transaction. I give you free services in return for your data. Sorry, not sorry. Of course, there is a lot of value that gets extracted. Little to no value gets cascaded back to the data generators, including creators. So if you're creating a nice video on Instagram, you know, how much are you actually monetizing? Like, what's the percentage of you as a YouTube creator that you're actually getting in return as a fair share of the value that is generating out of advertising and so on? Probably YouTube is one of the best models. Facebook, Google itself, little to nothing, right? Or straight zero. And there is a whole industry. It's not just the straight platform, but it's an industry around the mining and the aggregation of data and aggregation of insight and intelligence out of large sets of data being triangulated from this. So that's, that we know. The second models that are not that intuitively known, but they are also very common, are trusts, data trusts. And we're not talking about a legal entity or anything of that sort. This is kind of different. It's a more of my intangible construct. So that's when you have data that gets collected from generators, right? They are pooled into a data trust, right? There is pools of data that come together to become like a superset of data. And the participants into the data trust reap the advantages out of these larger data sets. And it can eventually, come across as a monopoly once again. But it's just that it is not just one party that is hoarding all of this data. It's a coordinated effort of pooling across large data sets anyway. And then this trust is enforcing that decision-making layer where they are selling access to the data, or they are controlling the markets by curbing competition, by denying access to the data to protect incumbents, right? There are several examples in this, but again, it's not a legal entity. It is a governance tool, right? We have called it also data consortia. We've seen this replicated also at blockchain level in some ways. And it becomes a vehicle for data sharing. So we are pulling resources, sharing the data, but it's a closed network. Not like only the people within that trust are invited to the party, and only they can extract the value out of that. So Mobi is one example on the blockchain side, but there are plenty of other examples in the Web2 traditional world as well. And it raises questions about data ownership, of course, because if you're creating like a superset of data and you have ownership over the individual data sets, then you have a derivative where the sums of the individual data sets is more valuable because you can triangulate data and get additional insight over it. That becomes like a new creation. So who owns that data sets is the data trust itself. An alternative model is the data-centric data trust. So that's when the data generator themselves become a union, right? From that, it was the data collectors, remember, that are coming together. Here is the data generator that are coming together. And again, they negotiate access to the data, but this is more democratically coordinated. So it's almost like a cooperative. And there is financial value that is redistributed back to the individual members. So remember, data generator are users, right? They're coming and they are generating and they are trying to enforce access or deny access to this data, right? For example, I don't know if you remember or if you have ever experienced like a boycott of some of platforms, right? That's a way of enforcing a data trust that is generator-centric, right? Boycott Facebook, right? We don't like what you do. I don't use it. I don't use you anymore. Therefore, you don't have access to my data anymore, right? So then there is an extreme of this model, which is a generator-centric, where you don't even have like a formal way of pooling this data. It is just the generators of the data are collectivizing, right? The data itself is not pooled. It's just that they are coordinating. Right? That can be very informal as well. But I think this is where, you were asking me earlier whether the data storage can be flipped around, right? The data ownership with the data storage can be flipped around. And this is exactly the model that I think is going to come into play, where you have a federation of individuals with their own individual data sets, and they're coordinating access to the data so that the data itself can become more valuable because it's triangulated with other data or pooled with other data, but that's completely in the control of the data generators. Okay, it's a lot of information. I'm very painfully aware that it is a lot. So I'm going to take a little sip of water and leave a little of a breather, for questions and reflections up to now.
Sure. So also with all the discussion on the data, so I believe we on the internet and in general, we as an individual, I'm producing two types of data. So labeled data as to specific information about me, and unlabeled data as in my general activity, which does not, wherein I'm just a data point and there's no individuality to it. So is that something, what I'm trying to say is, so with social network, the data is labeled. That's my behavior or my actions on that particular platform, and they're able to monetize it by directly targeting the ads. So, but there are other forms of data sets that I'm generating, as in, if I go grocery shopping, that the supermarket would analyze the activity of its consumers in total and try to see what to stock. So data like that. So right now I have seen business models in Web3 around the label data set. Do you think we can also do something for the unlabeled data set? And do you see some opportunities there?
I think so. But it must be very deliberate. So if you are asking, will there be a model within Web3 that will collect as much data as Web2, where you are mining any type of interactions that can become a data point, which is the Web2 model, right? Hoard as much as you can. Will there be a parallel in Web3? I don't know, and I hope not, and I don't think so. I think the public, like the users of Web3, will be hard enforcing their privacy rights. You will be technologically and cryptographically enforcing the limitations of your data creation. Equally, there will be some pressure. Like, I am dreaming about this beautiful world where whoever is trying to data mine would be socially frowned upon. Similarly, like now businesses who are spamming, they are seen as inferior, right? In the same way, I am envisioning a world where any business online who is hoarding data about you is seen as very intrusive. Customers will just not use the service. They will be out of business because of that. There will be so much social pressure over that. It's already seen in Web3. Like Web3 is the users of Web3, although we are still very early days, hasn't penetrated any large markets yet. But you've seen strong preferences for privacy-preserving solutions across the board. From, for example, Brave browser, which I'm using right now, you're hard enforcing your privacy through cryptography or through strong architecture in the backend that will not be able to see your data to begin with. Or alternatively, you will be allowing the data, even if it's de-anonymized. I don't think that there is a big difference in the end, right? As long as you're profiling people, whether it's anonymized or de-anonymized, it's the same as metadata. Like the US government was saying, don't worry, we're just collecting the metadata, which means that they know exactly who you're speaking to, when and where, but they just don't attach your name to the calls, right? It doesn't matter. The anonymized data, it's still intrusive if at scale and triangulated with other data sets. So I think it's equally dangerous both ways.
Right, certainly. And you also mentioned the Brave browser. And so their business model and their tokenomics work with the token of the basic attention token. And so that's one of the models we've seen for social media in particular. So what other business models do you see coming up in Web3 around data?
Okay, so when it comes to mining data, I don't think that data itself will have a lot of value. As you will see, like one of the things that we will see in blockchain is that a lot of the data, or most of the data, at least from infrastructure point of view, is widely available, right, to everyone. Therefore, the value itself is zero. The value comes from the services that are built on top, or the tooling to make use of the data, right? That's when you have indexing, for example, data indexing that becomes a great value add, or data analytics like GraphQL, any data analytics, Dune Analytics, as a platform, because the data is widely available to anyone. Like, you're not going to go and buy on-chain data. Why would you, right? It's free. It's transparently available and, accessible by everyone. But it's the services on top that will be monetized. When it comes to consumer products, I do envision a demand for a fair share of redistribution of value. So that's a consent-based model, which is exactly what Brave is saying. Like, are you consenting for me to show you two pop-up marketing messages a day, or 10? Are you clicking? Then I'm going to give you money for it, right? I'm going to give you tokens for it, right? You have my attention, and it's explicit. Like, that transaction that we were seeing earlier is out in the open. And there is, short-term direct distribution of value. Yeah, you can see that. You can enlarge that in terms of business model in a different way, not just with straight bank, money into the bank account, but with access, right? Access to services, or access to better opportunities or discounts and so on. That's also a very viable business model that will come more and more.
Right, certainly.
Right. Okay, it's so much to unpack, right? It's so interesting. There is so much to say. I will try and go a little bit fast because I think this is intuitively known, which is the data commons. That's when you're pulling a lot of data together, and you're getting a lot of. You have to give a lot of interoperability over access to data. So you have to standardize it. You have to have ways of accessing it, but the data itself becomes common resource, right? And there is, the whole movement for data commons is for this data to be collectively transparent, right? That's when, as a collective creation, we all have access to it. We all have the same rights over extracting value from it. And some will go as far as saying that it's actually a human right to have a right to the copy of every single piece of data that is produced out there. If you remember the very initial definition that we have given around public infrastructure with data produced by the wider public, then it's the next step is to say, hey, it's human right for everyone to have access to it and to extract value from it. But that would mean driving the value of data to zero, right? Which is the same that it's happening with, or that is obviously happening with public blockchains. The data itself, the value is zero, but the value is created then on top, on the excess, right? And you will see, like with public blockchains, there is this collective transparency that enforces security and so on. Yeah, I'm gonna go also very fast on the centralized data commons. That's when you would have like a government hoarding all the data on behalf of everyone and then redistributing it to others. I think it's highly unlikely that we will ever get there for surveillance, but then you will see China model is essentially going in that direction. It's a centralized, government-controlled data commons, and you will have, increasing privacy concerns, but also a lot of security concerns over the vulnerability of these massive data sets. Plus, if you're chucking everything in there, it's very difficult to weed out the false or inaccurate data, right? I think decentralized data commons can solve for that, because you will have an incentivization around it for the quality of the data sets. But then you would have to create models around reputation or staking over the quality of the data sets, right? So then, that's something, for example, the Ocean Protocol, the initial concept of the Ocean Protocol, for which I was one of the founders, was actually, at the core of there. Okay, so all of this was, I feel like a kind of a complex but very necessary, large, open to the Web3, and now we can get onto the interesting bits, I think, as far as I'm concerned. So there are a few myth busting that I think we can go through. I hear a lot that there is data, there is like the data sets or private information used on the blockchain. In reality, it's a spectrum. So there is on-chain data on public or private blockchains, and it varies over availability, searchability, and access and transparency. R3, Hyperledger, you can still have open source code, but the data itself is closed to a network. Or Ethereum and Bitcoin, everything is accessible by everyone. Then you have other models like Monero, where the data technically is there, but you cannot search the actual intelligence that you want to extract from it. So it's a good thing. Privacy preserving solutions are coming thick and fast. I'm particularly liking what the Polygon team is doing on adding ZK rollups and increasingly more and more privacy preserving solutions. I think that will be actually the bridge from Web3 as we know it, and Web3 largely, large adoption of Web3 by businesses, where you have a compromise between a public infrastructure and a privacy preserving transactions at the same time. So in terms of data ownership, you will still have a degree of innovation on the data storage side. IPFS is one, of course, distribution of data across multiple units and fragmentation of this data so that it's not easily aggregated, other than for those who really know the addresses associated with IPFS. And then the biggest misconception that I've seen is that smart contracts hold data. They don't. They hold a pointer to the data, and typically the data storage sits within a distributed storage such as IPFS, and then that's how the data itself gets accessed. So that opens a lot of conversation over a decoupling between the ownership of the data and the storage of the data, right? So NFTs are a chief example for that, right? So you have the smart contracts, no data storage in there. There is this link to the data and metadata. Then there is a token ID that identifies uniquely that link to the data and metadata on IPFS for that specific smart contract. All of this is done using standard ways so that people can access it and can read it and can code it very easily. And then there is a persistent storage or just normal storage to ensure that that valuable asset remains persistently there, right? The people think that you can just put it on your server, AWS server, and then code a smart contract, and that's an NFT that will have value 15 years from now. I highly doubt that that specific server will be up and running in 15 years, unless you're really using other type of very difficult, and expensive infrastructure, right? It cannot be changed, right? People misunderstand this. You have to have a persistent storage solution over that. So you can see, like, if you remember what we said about the data stewardship, where you regulate access and rights over the data. Essentially, what we're saying that with NFT, that's hard-coded into the smart contract. So whatever is the ownership that relates to the stewardship that we've seen before, the extraction of the value out of the decision-making that stems from the stewardship, that it's embedded within the NFT itself. It's very interesting, right? It's the transfer of the NFT that executes the extraction of value. It's not the data storage on IPFS of the asset, right? Whether I am storing it one place or the other, that does not associate me with the ownership over that data asset. Is the NFT itself, the transaction of the NFT itself. So I find that to be quite new and quite interesting. So, it's the transfer from the execution of the transfer form function with the use of the right private-public key pairing that will authorize the transfer that really extracts the value of the data.
Right. So with NFTs, we can transfer ownership. So do you think we can also enable some form of copywriting, maybe renting out your particular data and leasing your data?
Yeah, you can. For example, there are a lot of already reasonably established and tested models for enforcing royalty, like perennial royalties over NFTs. So you are an artist and you say that you would want to have 10% over the royalties on each transfer of that NFTs during its lifetime. That's effectively enforcing your economic claims over the generation of your art. So it's the enforcement of the copyrights over that, at least as far as the extraction of the value for that copyright in a way. It is still nascent, but it is, let's put it this way, it is at goodwill of the marketplaces as of now to enforce it. But it is already progress, in my opinion, because once again, I think once the social pressure will come and there will be a way of bringing to light all of this to the wider public, then if OpenSea is not actually respecting that clause that is embedded by the artist, that will be seen as, as exploiters of the creators, which is just against their brand. So that would be an interesting, in the future, I think that will happen very soon.
Right.
Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah. And I think that the next level of value extraction from data comes from what I call tokenization of reality. So it's not just the piece of art, but you can actually go with any asset, right? Including money, right? You can tokenize money as well, right? So how does it work? First of all, you have to lock in your assets in a way that cannot be moved, right? You have to immobilize that, right? It has to be locked in a storage and has to be in custody of someone trustworthy. So that asset, it's backed by something that is not moving. Then, so that could be shares, for example. Shares is a very good example. And then with the same dynamics that we explained for the NFTs, you create a pointer to that storage, to that custodial solution for that asset. And then you have the transfer of the value comes on the token itself. So let's say, for example, that you have your shares and you cannot monetize them because your company is not going IPO, or you're not going to have any event or fundraising that will monetize your shares, but you're tokenizing your shares. By tokenizing your shares, you have a way of making those shares liquid as long as you don't sell those shares and you don't move them. That's a massive new, stream of data extraction, value extraction out of data, right? It's a virtualization of assets that gets tokenized.
So in that way, it is building an entire token economy over the existing economy. So
Yeah, how fascinating is that, right? You have virtualization on one side with the metaverse, and then you have the tokenization of assets on the other. So you have
Right.
almost two rails, right? You have, brick and mortar and then virtualization. And I suspect that the two things that will get more and more merged, as we
Right.
go forward with reality.
Right.
Yeah, and then of course you have, the reverse. It's also true, right? You can reverse this project, this process, where you can just burn the token, unlock the assets, and then do whatever you want in the real world with the original assets. And it's really
Right.
interesting and nice because everything is encrypted. Even if it's on public chain, nobody will know what you have actually done. It doesn't matter. At the same time, you have to have traditional infrastructure at the back end. So it is, to me, it's like incremental innovation is not disruptive innovation, which I think it's the fastest way of growing for Web3, because you will maintain or you will open up new business model and new revenue streams for existing incumbents. Then they're going to be supportive, right? You're not going to detract anything. You're going to add new opportunity for custodial services. By custodial services of assets, of course, we know it's banks, right? Right? We are playing along, with financial institutions to get them, to play along and get some value for themselves as well, right? And the important part here is that the bank remains as a custodial institution, but not anymore as an intermediary or as a gatekeeper for the value extraction.
Right.
You don't need anymore a broker. Once the tokenization happens, you will extract it by yourself because you own your own private key, right? You can extract value directly.
Right.
So in all of this is nice, but then we know that the actual reality of Web3, it's just nascent. There is a lot of hybrid happening. So if you think that it's like a perfect solution, it's not. We're not there yet, or fully mature infrastructure. It's not. It's still a hybrid infrastructure, 99.9% of the time. Though there is, it's fast moving. So very recently, I think it was a couple of days ago, HubSpot hack. Everyone is using HubSpot. even DeFi platforms, they still need something. So it's what I call the Web3 mullet. I actually find it so funny, but it's very, very true, right? You have got Web3 in the front and Web2 at the back. So that means that from a data governance and risks, you have the same infrastructure. You have to be, taking care, over, the potential risks for data monopolies to happen in terms of vulnerability for data lakes and data storage and how that happens. Platforms in the end, they're still running on the internet. There's still a strong connection to traditional servers and infrastructure.
Right. So perhaps a lot of products are using Web3 as a marketing ploy at this point.
Sorry, didn't catch that?
As a marketing ploy, just for the sake of marketing, they're using a Web3 mullet. Is it?
No, I don't think it's I don't think it's wanted. I think it's not like a deliberate way of misleading.
Okay.
I think it's just that as an industry, we're still figuring it out. There are so many, and that's why I think, as if you're asking me where are the opportunities or where is the the big chunk of evolution that needs to happen in Web3 now, definitely still at infrastructure level. Like we don't have enough tools to be natively end-to-end Web3.
Right.
There is so much patchwork, a lot of working as bandits to try and make it work, a lot of Scotch tape at the back to make it so that the user experience is plausible, like not great, but plausible. So I don't think it's an intention to mislead people. It's just that we just want to make it work, But I just say that we should be very well aware that the same risks from a governance and data security point of view, they're still there. So we have to be extremely careful. Plus, there are all the complexities. For example, one of the things that, going back to the HubSpot, people got really, really scared because they thought that the marketing database had a pairing between email addresses and public keys.
Right.
Then you have a massive at-scale de-anonymization of public keys. Then
Right.
it becomes a massive problem. Massive problem. Because once they know your public key, unless you stop using it, they will know exactly what you're doing with your assets. But still, the historical data will be forever for them to see.
Right, certainly.
Right. So it's massive, like you have to be extremely careful. So just the last, parting slide, it's been like a long ride up to now, but that's what I was hinting right at the beginning. I think the future is towards a generator-centric data trusts or data models more in general, where the trust itself at the governance level is hard enforced with technology. So it's encrypted, it's hard encrypted. And it's a consent-based type of logic that governs that. So the generator, the data generator, the end user gives consent, and that consent is hard enforced, is not privacy policy driven, and that privacy policy changes over time, and you have no power to say no in reality, right? But it's hard enforced, and they have, because the data generator is also the data collector, then they can hard enforce access to the data as well. So it flips around where then data providers must ask for permission to access the data from the data generator themselves, right? It's flipped around. It's flipped around. So it would be Facebook that comes to Pratik and say, Pratik, can I please see your data? It will not be Pratik to say, hey, can you please not see this data? Or can you please stop looking at my data? Right. It will be completely flipped around. And there will be, a lot of innovation that will happen on how that is implemented at infrastructure level, at data storage levels specifically. That's one big chunk, right? If I am collecting my own data, then how is data storage going to work out, right? How can I hard enforce access to my data? And how can I then enforce my preferences on the outside? So that's when self-sovereign data comes into play. And that's when SSI will come into play. DIDs will come into play big time, and so on. And then the last, there will be, a layer of economics incentives that will come, and there will be coming to reward directly the data generator, like the data users, right? A simple model like that goes with Brave, right? Service providers can still pull data, get large data sets for themselves, but it is consent-based, it is controlled, hard enforced by you. If you want to deny access forever, then you will deny forever. There will not be like a ghost copy of your data on Google forever, and so on. So yeah, it's a bit out there, but I still think that 40 years from now, hopefully we're going to come and reflect again and see that we've done good and we have created a fairer internet, overall. So, looking back at that, data-driven world would be an era of involuntary transparency. We are getting there on trying to really challenge it, in my opinion, where there will be a voluntary transparency and a redistribution of value attached to it. That will be fair. It will be fair.
Right, certainly. So I believe there's still a lot of infrastructure in Web3 that needs to be built to enable this kind of transparency and access.
Absolutely. It's absolutely exciting time, I think, to be at this time in Web3 around any infrastructure play is like pioneering work every day. And if you don't feel the pain, then you're not pioneering hard enough. If you don't hit a limit over what is possible and you have to chart solution something for the first time, then you're not deep enough into the Web3 rabbit hole, in my opinion. there are so many problems and not enough people to solve them. So the industry is there. Anyone is very much, welcome to just, get stuck in and give it a go for sure.
Right, certainly. And thank you very much, Alex, for the talk. So we'll also have many students and young professionals, watching this talk when we publish it through different channels. So do you have some advice for them in particular? What are the opportunities in Web3 for students and how they can, actually get into it?
Yes, of course. First of all, in general, connect with me, especially on LinkedIn. If you feel that, especially if you're like a young person with needing some mentoring, some legs up, some access to the network, just ping me, especially if you want to put, hey, I listened to this data talk, ideas, and that's why I'm connecting with you, then for sure, it's there for me, to know that you are in tune already with what we have discussed today. But I think in general, there is a skills shortage as a whole. So if you're planning or thinking of getting into Web3, just have no doubts, come. There are so many jobs. There is really great career opportunities. There is a lot of uncertainty and ambiguity. So career-wise, you've got to be comfortable with not knowing. That's a major point in Web3. I would shy away from quick opportunities for a buck. I think the long game is with infrastructure. There is so much to be built still that whatever we're building now the 1990s of Web 2. That's where we are. Right? It would be silly to try and do like another pet store online when you could be Google, right? So that's the level of opportunities that are there. In terms of Web3 and knowledge development, it's the curse of Web3 that everything is widely available for free. That can become very overwhelming because you don't know where to start. So I would suggest join communities of developers using Discord in particular, and then go on to GitHub and get stuck in and code straight. If you don't do it and break it, then you're not doing it hard enough. So that's very important that you try and test it. And follow the conversations on Twitter. There is a lot of thought leadership, informal thought leadership that is happening on Twitter. So crypto Twitter is like literally you can reach out with one tweet to some of the most influential people that are moving the needle in the industry. It's as simple as that. So don't be shy in that sense. Other than that, yeah, data is a great play. So it's complex. So don't get disheartened, but definitely rewarding. And in particular, shout out to all the women's out there. If you're even remotely thinking that there are barriers to you coming in the industry, drop me a line and just go for it. Like really, like the industry needs more diversity. I can't tell you how many times I'm the only woman in the room. Like so many times is just sometimes is not ideal, but it's getting better. So especially, if you can advise or mentor in your circle, then bring everyone in. We need more diversity, not just gender-wise, on any any vector. Yeah, that's that's it.
Right. Certainly, I think if we do not get enough women on board onto Web3, we we have the risk of encoding all those biases and the one side kind of a thinking into the Web3 community ecosystem as well. So I think that is definitely needed. So
unfortunately, I think like just as a parting thought, there is a lot of publicity that goes into clickbaiting articles, but the good stuff is happening in silence.
Right.
Media attention will not go on to like the new ERC 721 or 1559, the release of that. You will not get, the FT to talk about that, right? But that's where the good stuff is happening. Like, so building infrastructure.
Right, certainly. And so just as a final thought, so what do you think of the legal environment and enabling environment? We know for a fact that particularly within Singapore, the government is quite open to supporting crypto and Web3. How do you see the international legal landscape for enabling this?
So I think that there is maturity happening. There's been a lot of experimentation. It's going to become easier and more commonplace, if anything, because there has been a lot of myth busting happening over time. Like, for example, the blockchain is used for money laundering. If you are seeing what is going on now between Russia and Ukraine and the moving of funds, they actually figured out, the penny is dropping, that if you're trying to move crypto, you cannot realize that value unless you are de-anonymized. So
Right.
it is actually the worst tool possible to move money illicitly, right? So I think the regulators are, in general, they're more cautious in environment where there would be biggest impact on the end consumers. So I mean in terms of scale. So you will see that, for example, European Union is going slowly. The US SEC is going very, very slowly. City-states like Singapore are more agile, so they're moving faster. But SECs and European Union, they're watching, they're learning from the experiments from Singapore, Malta, Luxembourg. So I think the direction is very promising. Taxation is happening, clarity over taxation. That was a big problem. Accounting also, there is especially in Singapore, there's so much maturity that is happening from both legal professional and accounting professionals. So adoption, if you're asking me, is the regulatory environment facilitating widespread adoption so that we can get more mainstream adoption from large businesses? A resounding yes. I've seen also trends from within enterprises to hire talent that understands crypto. It's pretty unavoidable, right? They are educating themselves, so it's still early days, but it's happening. So to have a lawyer within a large bank that understands crypto custody, had you asked me 3 years ago, I would say like, nah, it's not gonna happen, right? Not today.
Right.
Just now, definitely so.
Right, certainly. And what do you think are the opportunities for a nation like India, with a population of over 1 billion people? And what place do you see for India in Web3?
It's actually very interesting because Web3, there is this label of democratizing something, right? And there is always something that you can democratize using Web3, right? Whether it's compelling enough, that's a secondary thing. But giving the large scale of needs for even basic services in India, I think that there would be a booming market within Web3. One side is the talent resources that is happening. It's a huge community of developers, Web3 developers in India, rising fast, highly professionalized. It will be a big service market that will come from India to the outside, for sure. Right. Then in terms of end consumers, I see a lot of movement around the use of data for unlocking basic services or participation in the digital economy from, for example, blue-collar workers, undeserved from financial institutions, like difficult to get access to loans, for example, very difficult for them to prove their credit score, temporary migrant workers, very difficult to prove their worth, micro entrepreneurs, very difficult for them to get a loan from the bank. They don't have the paperwork in place. So Web3 is coming, and one side is giving them through DeFi straight opportunities to create credit scoring history. On the other is unlocking straight DeFi products for them. On the other, on the data generation, I think more and more, with verifiable credentials, that's happening. There is a great project called Good Worker, who is doing a lot of good work on supporting blue-collar workers specifically using verifiable credentials. So I think it's moving, and it's such a large population, so many gaps. Internet connection is still a bit bad. So in general, internet connection in rural areas is definitely not there. So there will be a gap. But then there can be, I can see leapfrogging onto mobile access to Web3 and play to earn, for example. I've seen model around watch to earn, right? So there is like a redistribution of value from interactions with the platforms that can bring value all the way to the edges.
Right, certainly. So, with India, we also went our own digital transformation with the COVID, and so very recently, a very large population of internet, very large population has got internet access, just quite recently. So we are yet to see what comes of it. So with that, I think we can close the talk. And thank you very, very much, Alex, for taking out your valuable time. And it was definitely very insightful. And I certainly thoroughly enjoyed your talk. Thank you very much for coming to ITS.
Thank you so much, Pratik. And I will make available the slides on LinkedIn. So as soon as we get also the video posted out there, I will make sure that there is a good link to the slides themselves, so that people can just reread through whatever was valuable. So thank you again for the opportunity, and hope to see you guys sometimes very soon.
Thank you.
Take care. Bye-bye.